coming. My name is Utpal Misra. I'm a senior governance manager with the governance team at International Republican Institute, and it's my pleasure to be the coordinator for this event and to welcome you all. We've been having this session for 2.5 days now, and I have to say, none of you look like a stranger to me. It seems we are a big, happy family. But of course, there are certain issues that we can talk about. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to frame this session and also to shamelessly promote some of our work. You can hate me for that, but I've seen others do it in their sessions as well. So I'll take my chances, then hand it over to the panel. Now, the reason why we're doing this, right? All of us are working in the anti-corruption field. We know about different types of corruption, petty corruption, political corruption, grand corruption. I don't need to go into the details. But when it comes to kleptocracy, what we found was that the nuances, right, the understanding was a bit different in different quarters, in different countries, different regions. And even here in the United States, whenever we talk about kleptocracy, we hear about authoritarian regimes, mostly about them, whereas kleptocracy is something more broader. It's not just limited to one type of government. Also with the understanding of what kleptocracy means, IRI has been working on this field in different country settings. We've worked in South Asia and in Central America, where we found that the activists and the anti-corruption champions were not really familiar with this concept of kleptocracy, and they were not able to discern the different aspects of it. So, and we came up with something called the Kleptocrats Playbook. There are some copies lying at the back if you want a physical copy. Or if you want to download it, there's a QR code that could be screened up. Maybe you could download the book for your reference. There we try not only to define what kleptocracy is, but of course, there would be some difference in the actual definition of things, but also to come up with a taxonomy of different tactics that these kleptocrats use all over the world, so that the anti-corruption activists and policymakers would have a tool to understand this in more granular level, to see the trends, to look at the what are the tactics used by the kleptocrats, and to apply that in their own country settings and to understand it further. So as we explain it, it's a systematic transnational corruption involving political, business, and criminal elites and their professional intermediaries for the purpose of illicit self-enrichment or furtherance of political objectives, right? So there are different aspects of it. It's the political, business, and criminal elites coming together, aided by groups of professionals, lawyers, bankers, and you've heard it in other sessions as well, right? So now and why are we doing this? As I said, we want to move the focus a little bit away from just authoritarian regimes and see how kleptocracy is taking root in so-called democracies or fledgling democracies all around the world. So we have a great panel here who will be talking about how kleptocracy functions in their own respective settings. And maybe in the end, we can talk about how, together as a community, how as policymakers, we can work together and find some ways to tackle this phenomena. So with that, I would like to hand the mic over to our moderator of the day, Dilrukshi. Dilrukshi Handunnetti is the executive director of the Center of Investigating Reporting Sri Lanka. She has extensive experience in reporting across South Asia and has covered corruption, communities, health, conflict, and the environment for publications including in the New York Times, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and The Humanitarian. She's an award-winning journalist, investigative journalist, and a senior editor. She advocates for human rights with a special focus on freedom of expression and women. A lawyer by training, she currently serves as the co-convener of South Asian Women in Media Sri Lanka chapter. And I also have to say that we've worked with Dilrukshi for a number of years, and she's been in the front line in this fight against kleptocracy and corruption. So I hand the mic over to you, Dilrukshi.
Thank you so much, Utpal. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to justify as to why I'm here as your moderator, if you're just wondering. So I'm just going to take 2 minutes and introduce my 3 panelists quickly. As an investigative journalist working in Sri Lanka, I've spent 2 decades uncovering corruption, grand corruption, kleptocracy. There was little public buy-in for a long time, and often missionary journalism is a lonely craft. Not too many people support you. And we were often targeted legally, physically, and also through negative public narratives. And I think I speak for most people who are here who go through this oftentimes. Here is a case study, a small example from the work we have been doing. In 2007, we did a series of investigations on 4 old MiG-16 fighters being purchased by the Sri Lankan Air Force from a Ukrainian agency. It was no government-to-government deal as it was claimed at that time. 2 newspapers exposed this scandalous, corrupt deal. This involved the recently ousted Sri Lankan president and his clan. We tend to get nepotistic there a lot. $10 million were paid to a ghost company, and we got selectively sued. The other newspaper was spared. So I just want to give you some context from Sri Lanka, because a lot of people do know about Sri Lanka right now, and think about it. After 8 years of litigation, we lost the case. No surprises there, of course. So I started the series, but someone else paid the price. And I'm sure, again, this is something that is pretty close to most people's heart. My editor, Lasantha Vikramatunga, the year 2000 Integrity Award winner, and the 2009's UNESCO Press Freedom Award winner, really paid the ultimate price for investigating corruption involving the country's top leaders. We do know the risks and the pain that comes with it. But the world needs inspiration and course correction, and we have this panel here. So today we have an expert panel of speakers who will also share their experience as well as expertise with all of you, stories of survival and of pushing the envelope about solutions, not just the problems that we often talk about. They will tell us why they do what they do. So let me now introduce you to the 3 practitioners here according to the order of speaking. So they will have two rounds of questions, and then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. My first speaker to my right is Lester Ramirez. He's the Director of Governance and Transparency at the Association for a More Just Society at Transparency International, Honduras. His work at ASJ covers a variety of disciplines, including anti-corruption reform, conflict and violence prevention, the rule of law, citizen evaluation, and investigative journalism. Lester previously worked as a project coordinator for the Honduran Banking and Insurance Commission, as legal counsel for the UNDP in Honduras, and as a human rights investigator for the Honduran Human Rights Commissioner. He holds a law degree from the National University of Honduras, a master's in business law from the Leiden University in the Netherlands, and a PhD in government and public administration from the Complutense University of Madrid, Spain. Thank you for being here. Yeah? So we'll just introduce the other 2, and then I will open the floor. Then we also have Mariyam Shiuna, who is our second speaker, who comes from the Maldives. She's the former president of the Maldives Anti-Corruption Commission. Also, she was the former executive director of Transparency Maldives. She has had 10 years or more working in this field. In both roles, Mariyam took a lead in advocacy and in developing key anti-corruption policies, such as the Maldives' first national anti-corruption policy by the IACC, the anti-corruption agenda for clean governance by Transparency Maldives, and other anti-corruption legislation in her country. She has previously worked at Maldives Research, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Maldives, and also the UNDP there. She also holds a master's in violence, conflict, and development from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and a Bachelor of Arts in the History from the London Metropolitan University. Thank you, Mariyam, for being here. And last but not the least is our third speaker, Paul Massaro. He serves as the staff of the US Helsinki Commission. We are very happy to have you here. We also lost a couple of moments, worrying about it.
Almost didn't find the hotel.
Yeah. Yeah. Paul is a senior policy advisor. His portfolio includes counter-corruption, human rights, sanctions, illicit finance, and energy security. Pretty much the same, everything. A leading expert on global corruption, he has contributed to numerous counter-corruption legislation in the United States. He also facilitated the creation of the Congressional Caucus Against Foreign Corruption and Kleptocracy and the Interparliamentary Alliance Against Kleptocracy. He was a Penn Campbell Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy and a Fellow at the Robertson Foundation for Government. He holds a master's in public policy, international security, and economic policy from the Maryland School of Public Policy, and a bachelor's in government and Germanic studies from the University of Maryland. I also want to note that whatever Paul says here is his personal opinion, and it does not represent the official position of the US government. So that
disclaimer.
said, I will take questions. First, are you ready?
Yes. I don't know if the mic is working.
Can we have Lester's mic working?
It's on. No.
So meanwhile, I'll ask the question. Oh. Thank you. So we'll have a couple of rounds of questions before we open the floor. But Lester, there was a lot of global attention on kleptocracy linked to authoritarian regimes in Eurasia as well as the Russian oligarchs. We talk a lot about this, right? Many understand grand corruption and the impact of communities. Can you briefly tell us how kleptocracy works and its transnational nature, with some examples from your country, from the region, and are the challenges any different?
Yeah. Thank you, Dilrukshi. I hope I said your name correctly. And thank you, everybody, for participating in this conference. I just want to firstly thank also the International Republican Institute for inviting us to this important forum. And I just want to say hello to all my compatriots that I know that some of them are here. Some of them are trying to understand English. I'll try to explain later on in Spanish. And I also want to thank the panelists here that I'm really, really honored to have panelists that understand the nuances of fighting corruption. Sometimes we, in the developing world, see corruption and fight corruption in a different manner because most of the times corruption is the rule and integrity is the exception, right? So when we want to fight corruption, we have to understand that the developing world has these nuances, and it's important to understand how kleptocracy works under the circumstances. Kleptocracy, if you want to understand you could say the wording, it means, the rule of thieves. For many years and many centuries, I think, we've been governed by authoritarian governments. At least for the last 300, 400 years, democracy has flourished, but all humanity has been basically dominated by kleptocrats. And now that we talk about democracy, being a part of the model of government, we try to understand how kleptocracy works under these situations. And we did this study in Honduras, a case study that you could say synthesizes around 7 years of our investigation of the president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez. The president, as some of you might know, has been extradited to the United States under drug trafficking charges. But when you listen to the general attorney and the prosecuting attorney press conferences in the United States talk about his extradition, around 70% of the wording that he mentions is about corruption. So mostly, the work that he did, corruption, kleptocracy, enabled his, different illicit activities. One being, of course, being accused of receiving bribes from Mexican drug dealers. In the case of Honduras, in our study, we found out that there are basically, you could say, 6 main factors in which kleptocracy flourishes. One, of course, is historical factors. We cannot deny how history works in defining our post-colonial institutions. There's an important writer, one of my favorites, James Mahoney, who writes about neo-institutionalism, and he talks about how, the institutions that the empires left in many of our countries in the developing world are still present, and how these institutions still have an effect in society and, of course, in government. The other is the institutional factor. I think it is important to mention that you need, of course, strong checks and balances, but also you need citizen controls. And those institutional factors enable also kleptocracy. The other, of course, is political factors, power relations, and something very important that we're not talking enough in these types of forum is political party structures, how political parties work, not only from the financial aspects, but how their internal democracy works also, the internal participation, and how new blood comes in, and mostly good people who want to be in politics also. The other aspect is societal. In the Honduran case, and this is something that we found out when we went to Mexico and shared our findings with other colleagues of the region, is that nepotism is something that also is very present when we talk about kleptocracy in the case of Honduras, and probably in many other cases in other countries. Nepotism, as you know, is part of the social fabric of many countries. Our businesses, our participation of the father, daughter, son, or family-owned businesses, but also in government, it is very common. And right now, also, we are seeing that in the Honduran case, that the president has her husband as one of the counselors, one of his you could say nieces is participating also in politics, and an array of other family members are participating also. And this creates a very thin line between public and private spheres. And the other aspect, of course, is globalization. And I think that's a big, you could say, difference between kleptocracy and systemic corruption or grand corruption, when we have transnational crimes or transnational transactions. But also it's something that we found in our study is that they are enablers, but not only professionals, talking about lawyers or accountants, but also multilateral organizations, banks that loan money to these countries, and to presidents, and to governments that are knowing that are committing corrupt acts. And of course, there are other countries who enable kleptocracy. In the case of Honduras, we have a neighboring country called Nicaragua, and many of the people who were involved in these acts of corruption have fled to Nicaragua. And the president of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, has, opened the door of the country and come in, you are here, this is a haven for kleptocrats. So we have to talk about the international aspects and the globalization aspects. And of course, one common denominator is poverty and inequality. Politics works through clientelistic networks in most of our countries, especially the developing countries, and this is one of the biggest enablers. At the end, I want to conceptualize corruption or kleptocracy as a systemic and permanent state of corruption that uses political powers to steal the nation's wealth, but at the same time, and this is very important, oppress its people. And this is something that we're not also talking. It's a way of oppressing people. And I think I know that right now the big issue is the war in Ukraine, but when we see kleptocracy in countries like Honduras, Nicaragua, Venezuela, for instance, it has a geopolitical impact in the United States through migration. Thank you.
Thank you. So Mariyam, next question is to you. The Maldives has taken us by surprise in recent years because of the cases of grand corruption and kleptocracy that we have seen in your place. How effective are anti-corruption agencies in countering kleptocracy? You know, you've spent many years doing that. What opportunities and challenges would you highlight based on your experience?
Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you, IRI, for inviting me to be part of this panel, especially on a topic that is really... Okay.
Ouch.
Okay, ouch.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Okay, especially on a topic that is relevant to many of our countries' countries' experiences in terms of governance and democracy. I would like to start off with by giving you a brief background. Or
Can you all hear her? No. Not really. Yeah.
okay. Okay. Give you some context in the case of the Maldives. So, the political context in the Maldives is a democratizing country. We've had, following 30 years of authoritarian rule, in 2008, we had our first democratic multi-party elections, an enactment of a new constitution with a comprehensive Bill of Rights, formation of independent institutions such as the Anti-Corruption Commission or the Human Rights Commission or a Supreme Audit Institution. And but despite these democratic gains, we've had major setbacks. We had a coup in 2012 as well. So democracy has been on a slippery slope where we've had periods where we've had democratic decline, then we see new administration come into power on the back of anti-corruption pledges and promises. So if you look at the type of corruption that mainly occurs in the Maldives, I would say petty corruption is not a major issue in comparison to grand corruption. And why I say this is because of when I was working at the Anti-Corruption Commission, the majority of cases or complaints that are lodged at the commission are also related to public officials in the top brass. And I wanted to highlight one particular grand corruption case where you can see how businesses, politicians, security forces collude together to siphon off public funds. So as Dilrukshi mentioned, more recently, or the past 6 years, the Maldives has grabbed a lot of international headline as a haven for the rich to launder money and buy off islands through cheap deals. I think you can see from the Al Jazeera documentary called Stealing Paradise or the recent OCCRP investigation will give you a picture of the way Maldivian islands are leased off through corrupt deals. This particular case is called the Maldives Marketing and Public Relations Corporation or MMPRC corruption case. This is the largest corruption case in the country in terms of what was stolen, who was involved, the impact, the cost of this corruption. It is also the biggest corruption investigation currently being undertaken by the Anti-Corruption Agency while I was working there as well, and it's still ongoing. So between 2014 and 2019, 59 islands and lagoons were leased through fraudulent deals, through no-bid deals, with an estimated $250 million missing from the state coffers through the sale of these islands. And this figure does not include kickbacks and other deals made behind closed doors in the sale of these islands. And out of this $259 million, we can actually trace $79 million which was paid as acquisition fee for the lease of these islands and lagoons, because this was, the fees were paid to state-owned enterprise called MMPRC, and MMPRC transferred the money to a private company, which was then transferred to different, or through either cash or checks, this was transferred to different individuals. And if you looking at the amount of money involved and the fact that these are the sale of our islands, Maldives is a country that has 1,190 islands, and out of this 59 islands we are talking about. So if you look at the entire scheme, the level of collusion, and how the entire system effectively failed, the case is unprecedented for a small country like Maldives. And the MMPRC case is still, there's an ongoing investigation. So when I was working at the Anti-Corruption Agency, I was one of the heads that was heads of institution that was leading the joint investigation that was taking place between the Anti-Corruption Agency, the police, and Presidential Commission that was formed to investigate this particular case. So under the joint investigation, which started in 2019, so far we've identified 300 subjects or beneficiaries of the MMPRC money. And out of these 300 subjects, we've got judges, we've got 44 former MPs, 16 current MPs, senior government officials from the previous administration, which includes 30 of ministerial individuals, 7 members of politicians from the current administration, security forces, companies, 5 heads of independent institutions, including the former chair and the vice chair of the Anti-Corruption Agency is also implicated in this particular case. And the money that was paid for the lease of these islands as acquisition fees have been used to pay off MPs for vote buying in the parliament, for floor crossing, in order to make constitutional amendments. And the money also manifested as gifts, office refurbishments of top public officials, as entertainment events and election campaigns. And as I said, we can actually trace where the 79 out of this 259, $79 million, who and who actually received it. And the entire scheme shows the level of impunity, the level of abuse of power at the top level, and how the entire system was rigged, in fact, and how they manipulated laws and the tourism industry in the country. And just bear in mind, this took place between 2014 and 15, which was at a time we were living under a very repressive regime where we've seen journalists, human rights defenders murdered, and anyone who's dared to speak up against that administration faced serious consequences. In fact, the Auditor General at the time, early 2014, he did release a special audit report raising red flag, but as a consequence of releasing that report, in fact, the next day after he released it, the Parliament changed the Audit Act to reduce his term from 5 to 3 years so they could get rid of him. And there was also another individual, a bank manager, who released the statements of the bank statements of the private company, which was used to siphon off this money. Because he publicly disclosed this information, he was sacked, he was imprisoned, and in fact he served longer than, he served more time in prison longer than his actual sentence as well. So as I said, the investigation is still ongoing, and even though my time at the Anti-Corruption Commission was not as long as it should have been, because I was forced to resign within 2.5 years of my time at the institution. So the investigation has been slow. Some of it has been deliberate because this entire system is rigged against you when you're trying to look at a case where politicians from across the political spectrum are involved in the case. But there have been positive developments as a result of this case because now we're collectively trying to strengthen the anti-corruption legal framework in the place. We've criminalized illicit enrichment. We've got a Whistleblower Protection Act passed. But I would say, in conclusion, there still lacks genuine political will to actually investigate the case and hold people accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. So just $59 million that you could account for, right? The rest of it you don't know where?
259.
Okay.
The rest we don't know.
So maybe Paul can tell us.
Right.
Yeah? So the question to you, Paul, is that the United States, United Kingdom, and many European nations often function as destination countries where kleptocrats really do invest and hold their wealth. So we really would like to know from you what the United States is doing to counter international kleptocracy, and how are you managing it?
Sure, yeah. Hard acts to follow. I mean, it's really amazing work being done here. I mean, it's funny for me to be on a panel on beyond authoritarianism and oligarchs, because I am, mostly authoritarianism and oligarchs. So it's good to think about, though, what these efforts mean for most of the world, right? I mean, it's not all Russia and China all the time, although sometimes if you're on Capitol Hill, that's what it feels like. It's just constantly, maybe 30% Russia, 70% China. It's a lot of China these days, and rightfully so. In any case, when you look at kind of I guess, the global financial structure, the global political structure of the world. You know, this is based off this notion planted kind of in '91 at the dissolution of the Soviet Union that we were going to deregulate everything, integrate everybody, and then democracy would follow. And sadly, sort of the opposite has happened. Rather, we've seen an almost unprecedented ability to loot. So the sort of anonymous structures and the availability of Western gatekeepers, as you'd mentioned, lawyers and even multinational institutions and multilateral institutions. So I guess both corporate and international organizations. I mean, it's just like everything has kind of been wrapped up in this ability to drain states of money and kind of bring that money into the developed world. And this is kind of I sometimes describe this as the nature of modern dictatorship, but it's every kleptocracy, right? And in some extent, you have to kind of admire some of these struggling, fledgling democracies that are like holding on to democracy even as these governments try to consolidate authoritarianism. I mean, at the end of the day, every single one of these governments would like to be an authoritarian state, right? I mean, the goal is to realize authoritarianism. But in fact, in a lot of these cases, the peoples just will not let them. They fight tooth and nail. They fight against corruption. They do amazing work, like right here in the Maldives Anti-Corruption Commission, and so on and so forth, to ensure that they cannot consolidate power. And that's fantastic. But they're in a losing war so long as we don't, clean up our act. And that's, I think, the biggest problem we face today is the enablers of corruption. And how do we stop this ability to drain these countries of resources and bring them into our countries where they have no positive effect. I mean, they end up influencing our politics negatively. They end up, leading to more corruption in our systems, to greater authoritarian influence in our systems, and so on and so forth. So we have confronted this, I think, from really a very broad angle. We're not just thinking about finance, although finance is a major part of it. And on finance, we've had some successes. Obviously, everyone here is probably pretty familiar with the Corporate Transparency Act, passed in 2020 to finally get the United States a beneficial ownership registry, which amazingly we haven't had until sort of like 2020, and still don't officially have, but the rule's getting into place. So we are catching up with our own sort of commitments. The Enablers Act, which I know Jake Sullivan spoke about in the plenary, which is wonderful, and the Biden administration has endorsed, and Secretary Pompeo has endorsed, and everybody seems to have endorsed on both sides of the aisle, although it's not going to pass this Congress, very sadly, or it certainly doesn't seem like it will, would finally create kind of due diligence requirements like banks. Banks have to ask basic questions of suspicious potential client. Where did you get the money? Somebody walks in with $15 million in cash. Yeah, where did you get the money? And normally when you ask, they walk out, right? I mean, they're not in the business of answering a bunch of questions. They know that this could come back to them. But if you don't have to ask any questions ever, you'll never catch anything. So we need to set up these tripwires to catch this money, to get these reports in, so that when these investigations get opened, they can be followed, and that somebody can actually these guys can actually answer for their crimes. So I do think we'll eventually get this into law. I think that there's just such bipartisan support. But it goes beyond that. I mean, it goes into the way that these guys are influencing our country and really all developed democracies politically, right? Because once you have gotten the money in the country, you want to influence our politics. You want to ensure that we're not against your government. Maybe we're even favorable to your corrupt government. Maybe we even end up defending it. We see it as kind of like a strategic ally or something of the sort. And that's why we also introduced the SHAME Act, the Stop Helping Adversaries Manipulate Everything Act, which would essentially make it illegal to accept compensation for lobbying for U.S. adversaries. And this is essentially to get us started down the track on fixing up kind of the foreign lobbying scene in D.C., which is just massive. I mean, it's just enormous, how many people go from government, you work on, fighting for human rights, fighting against corruption your whole career, and then you end up working for a government, in your post-career, in your lobbying career, doing the exact opposite, dismantling all the work you've done, or you go through the revolving door a few times. So, we have to ensure that we hit it on all angles, both the political angle and the financial angle.
Thank you. So we'll just take a quick second round, and maybe the answers can be shorter. Yeah. So just so that we can give enough time for the members of the audience. So I'll start again with Lester. Your work with the ASJ covers a variety of areas, including anti-corruption reforms, conflict and violence prevention, and the rule of law. Could you please share with us the relationship between corruption and violence? Because I think from your country, there are a lot of examples that you could share.
Yeah, thank you again. Well, first of all, I think that, my experience, I've been really privileged to work in different arenas with different types of actors also. Something that I've learned in the realm of fighting corruption is that fighting corruption is not the end. It's the means to the end, and I think that's something important. Many times we end up, thinking that corruption, if we get the person in jail, or we do this accountability, or we enact this legislation, that's our final purpose. And I think the final purpose is, in the case of our countries, so developing countries, is, helping the people who don't have a voice, getting the children to go to school, obtaining medicines for the needy, obtaining housing, and all those public services that many times our countries do not have. And I think that's something that is very important to have. Another aspect, and I don't want to be alarmist here, but in the case of Honduras, and I guess many other of our countries in the developing world, corruption is part of the operating system. You are basically told, if you want to have a job, if you want to have a social mobility, if you want to have even an education, you have to play by the corrupt rules. And I think that is something that is always, I guess, a risk for us, because maybe we're not as affluent than the people who play by those rules. Maybe we lose our jobs in the case of Mariyam. But something that is very important when we fight corruption is also understanding that corruption breeds violence, and that's something that it's very, very important. Many of our countries, and especially in the case of Honduras, 7 or 8 years ago, we were one of the most violent countries in the world. We had the highest murder rate in the world, and one of the main factors of this murder rate was because the police, the military, and public officials were captured by corruption, by criminal organizations. So we have to understand also that corruption produces different types of violence, not only the criminal violence, but also one that for me is very important because it affects everybody in the country, and that is state violence. By state violence, I want to define exclusion, social exclusion. When we think about violence, we think about aggression, physical aggression, but also there's other, subtle means of violence, and that's exclusion. And in our case study, what we saw in the case study of El Programa Vida Mejor, that was a poverty reduction program, was that the poor people who did not play by the rules, who didn't vote for the political party in office, were excluded of the benefits of the social programs, excluded of water, sanitation, excluded of health, excluded of education. So when we see these types of kleptocracy where, it's linked to clientelistic networks, and that's basically the gasoline that fuels the machine, that's something that we really have to fight. And how do we fight this type of corruption? Well, we have to be very preventive. We have to see, when we talk about how to design poverty reduction programs, we have to understand that we have to include transparency, accountability, due diligence, all of these aspects when we design these programs. And those are the things that right now we're seeing that the risk of, again, having another cycle of kleptocracy because we're not really working on the design of these poverty reduction programs.
Thanks. Mariyam, you were talking about the Al Jazeera documentary, The Stealing Paradise. Through recent examples, we have been able to see the kind of, the depth of corruption that you find in a small country like the Maldives, right? So it's almost like hopeless. It has shocked the world, and it has taken all of us by really it has been a huge surprise to find Maldives to be so corrupt. Are you able to tell us a little bit about your work and also about the effective responses that you could actually come up with, by using a systemic approach? Because it is one thing to crib about it, but another to find solutions and fight it.
Thank you. Despite like the challenges that we faced, I would say, and even though I was forced to resign, we did make quite a lot of progress, I think, in terms of addressing some of the systemic failures that have actually facilitated or made space for the MMPRC corruption case to occur. So some of the good precedents that we did set include, we did send cases for prosecution against the former president, the former vice president, 5 former ministers. We also sent cases for prosecution against 2 sitting cabinet ministers, which was a first in the Maldives as well. And a number of reforms did take place, including reforming the entire anti-corruption institution within the 2.5 years. So some of the changes that we did include coming up with the national anti-corruption policy or strategy, which is again a first of its kind, which addresses many of the loopholes in the system which facilitated MMPRC corruption. And to be fair to the current administration as well, the current administration and many of the institutions are undertaking a lot of reforms in closing those gaps and addressing those loopholes. So for example, the joint investigation that started as a result of this case, again, that's a first of its kind where different law enforcement agencies are collectively working together. And work is also underway in establishing an asset recovery mechanism, again, something that wasn't there before, so we're still working on it. As I said before, illicit enrichment has been criminalized. We've got an income and asset declaration law that is currently being drafted. We've got an income tax regime currently in place. So overall, the legal framework we're working on it, it's continuously improving. But at the same time, like I said, although we've made progress, there have been many challenges, and I still question the political will on the current administration, who came on the back of anti-corruption pledges and solving the MMPRC corruption case. In my experience, the expectation was that, okay, the new administration is here. Here's the space for the anti-corruption agency to look into the case, go investigate, go prosecute. But this political will was only limited to those individuals from the previous administration, and I was not expected to look at any case or any ongoing case of the current administration, which I refused. And but in my opinion, there's still a lot of work that we need to do to, we have to remember that it's still the same anti-corruption commission. We have had serious capacity issues in investigating complex financial crimes, for example. Again, that's a new thing. So you can't expect the anti-corruption agency overnight to suddenly solve this case and hold people accountable. So there's still a lot of structural work that we need to do to solve this case and also prevent future cases like that.
The last one for Paul. So the Congressional Caucus Against Foreign Corruption and Kleptocracy, and we know that you played a huge role in creating it. But it has also given birth to several pieces of legislation, and there's been a process of reform. But we would also like to hear from you. All is not good. Where are the gaps? What needs to be corrected? What needs to be strengthened?
I mean, where aren't the gaps? Is this getting? I could also scream. No, I mean, they're everywhere. I mean, I honestly, I've sometimes described this space as kind of an embarrassment of riches. I mean, it's like I could give every single member of Congress an anti-corruption bill and still have anti-corruption work to do. I mean, it's really extraordinary, kind of the way the system's laid out right now. You described, Lester, it's kind of like corruption as a way of doing business, right? And I mean, I think we need to have a little bit more humility in kind of the developed world that we have corruption. it's a different kind. It looks different.
There's a commission behind that corruption.
Right. Yeah. And well, we make it legal, and then we sort of we say we don't have corruption. And I mean, it's a whole system that has, weakened our democracy, made us susceptible to authoritarian influence, is kind of leading to these massive political upheavals. I mean, you can go anywhere in this country, anywhere, left, right, center, up, down, whatever, and you can talk with your average American, they'll be like, yeah, DC's corrupt. Everybody will tell you the same thing. It's just like, they'll tell you the system's corrupt, something's wrong. And if everybody feels that way, then there's something to it. TI runs the Corruption Perceptions Index, right? It's like, perceptions of corruption matter. They matter a lot, And the reality is a lot of Americans think the system isn't working for them, and a lot of the world, this isn't just in the United States, right? This is all over the developed democracies. Everybody feels like, what the heck's going on, So I think we need to take this seriously. Now, are all the things that various politicians and various people point fingers at the thing? Like, no, obviously not. This is a sophisticated and frustrating phenomenon. It's something that's driven by, an ideological perspective that we've committed ourselves to for, decades and decades. And it's going to take a long, I think we're moving in the right direction. But it's both it's the laws, it's the gaps that need to change, but it's also the norms, it's the way we see ourselves that needs to change. We've been stuck in kind of a tired paradigm for the last half century that we'll deregulate and integrate everything and everything will be okay. But that's not really how it works. We need to build an economy based on the rule of law. We need to prioritize our values over short-term economic gains. It's a very, very hard thing to do because we've prioritized economic gains as like the key thing for in so many walks of our lives, especially over the last decades. But that's going to have to change. So there's a normative kind of perspective that needs to change, where we need to be constantly prioritizing, constantly waking up and fighting for our democracy again. It's funny to me that Americans could be raised on this kind of diet of eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and it's a republic if you can keep it. Is Benjamin Franklin's great line. But but we take for granted that somehow democracy is just going to continue. We don't need to engage. We don't need to absolutely not. All of this stuff is so fragile. Freedom is so fragile. And I know we're talking about Ukraine is a fledgling democracy. To be fair, it's they're fighting for their democracy. I guess it's never as clear to you as when you're in Ukraine that you see the whole if you can keep it, you're fighting every day, waking up fighting for your right to exist, for your right to be free and independent and sovereign. And I think that's where we need to go normatively. As far as the million different gaps we need to fill, yeah, there are a million different actual legal gaps But the big leap that the country needs to make, that the West needs to make, is that we have really serious corruption problems. Germany has a former chancellor working for Vladimir Putin. We've got major former leaders, Tony Blair, Francois Fillon, Karen Kneissl. We have members of the former members of the cabinet in the USA, former members of Congress. All these guys working for authoritarian regimes or corrupt regimes. All sorts of corrupt regimes, laundering and whitewashing reputations. What are we doing? So there's a big paradigm shift we're going through right now, but we need to go through it.
Thank you. Now the floor is open for questions. Utpal, we have a floating mic, right? Any questions? Okay. The lady here, and then. Just a minute. We'll get you a mic. Yeah. But before you, I saw her, so I'll move to you.
All right, thank you so much, esteemed panelists. You have been doing very informative remarks. My name is Maha Tambal. I work for DT Institute, managing Sudan Anti-Corruption Program. My question is, when it comes to fragile, fledgling democracy context, where people are demanding justice, and justice is a crucial component for transition. And people aims to see perpetrators accountable before the law. What kind of recommendations or guidance, maybe my question could be to Lester, that we can, guidance that can inform citizens to stay safeguarding governance reformation to dismantle like a profound kleptocracy system in countries like Sudan, for instance?
Thank you. $1 million question. I'm a lawyer, but not many people in my country know that I'm a lawyer. Because I'm not too much, when we talk about developing world, and we talk about the rule of law, we talk about culture, especially in places like Africa where there's also a lot of tribal relations that are very complex also. I think that we should, like Paul says also, we should review our way of understanding justice. I think, for me, justice is more of a communal aspect, has to be more of a communal aspect, has to be more of the neighborhood, of the community, of the village. I think that's where we have to start, especially the household. In my country, for instance, I did a study back 5 years ago. There was an impunity study. There were a lot of people were talking about how much impunity is in the country. So we started doing a study about impunity, and we found out that 97% of homicide cases end up in impunity. And then the one company hired me to do a study about violence and the relationship between alcoholism. And what I found out, talking to people who were jailed because of alcoholism or alcoholic deeds or physical fights outside bars or any type of nightclub, many of these people started having violence in their house. They were victims of abuse. They were victims of domestic violence. So I think that this is something that governments don't really tackle that much, and especially multilaterals also and donors don't understand that we want to reform justice. You have to reform, or you have to strengthen those community ties regarding justice, equality, and of course, transitional justice. And something that in Honduras, in the Honduran case, for instance, is not very common, and I always ask is, how can we restore justice to the victims? Because many of the processes, judicial process takes 5, 6, 7 years, and the victim wants the truth, wants answers, and they're not going to wait 7 years. So I'm a fair believer that we should, work on family relationships, power relationships, gender roles, issues like that, and that's how we construct, more of a rule of law that we can understand, other than the formal legality that everybody knows about. Thank you.
She got the mic. Okay.
Hi, my name is Jordan Kane, and I'm here from the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR. And my question for the panel is, I wonder if you could speak to your experience with foreign assistance, be it from the U.S. or other donors, and the way that foreign assistance empowers and entrenches networks of corruption and oppression, because that's something that we've written about and something that we're planning to write about further. Thank you.
Who is it directed at? Is there any particular speaker you'd want to?
Well, in the case of Maldives, with the change in administration, whenever an administration comes on the back of democracy promotion or anti-corruption, like we do have a strong inflow of support from international partners and foreign assistance working on anti-corruption and governance. But I think for me, in my opinion, what lacks is it's not conditional enough for me, because that window of opportunity that we have to make those changes is so limited. Within those 5 years, in volatile countries like Maldives, for example, we've had, following 30 years of authoritarian regime, in 2008, we had our first democratic elections and a democratic leader. 2012, within almost 3 years, we had a coup. So I think there needs to be more strategy in what do you do when that window of opportunity closes? What strategies are there to support human rights defenders, civil society organizations, or different institutions that are working on democracy promotion and protecting human rights in the country?
Thank you. I don't know, Paul, if you want to butt in or?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, in my experience, I'm very critical also of development aid and how it works nowadays. I was one of my first jobs with the UN, and I was really, really idealistic when I started working 20 years ago. And then I find out that it's all about money. You know, it's all about indicators and checking the boxes. And I don't know, I sometimes I feel that we're becoming an industry, you know. And I want to go back to those roots where I can be idealistic, you know. And I think that is one of the things that Paul is saying. That we're having this existential crisis everywhere, and one of those existential crises is in the development community also.
Yeah, I'll try to keep this really, really short. Just say I mean, like, you know, security assistance, I mean, it's, you know, different than development assistance. You know, I think you guys look at both, right? I mean, but with regard to security assistance, I mean, our assistance to Ukraine right now is basically saving the world, right? So I mean, there's definitely some that works. Like, I mean, it's really extraordinary. You know, I mean, I think we should be giving much more to Ukraine, right? I mean, like, but what we've given to Ukraine is, you know, acting as the bulwark for, you know, the free world against Russian imperialism at the moment. There are obviously other examples where, you know, you could put more serious question marks around it, where it does seem like, you know, our assistance is entrenching regimes. I guess the question for me in those cases is always, is the entrenchment of the regime the point of U.S. policy? You know, because I think in some cases it very much is. You know, I think in some cases the Pentagon makes decisions and weighs the pros and cons and says, okay, well, this is what we're going to do in this case, and yeah, it's not good for democracy, and generally speaking, I do not support those types of decisions, but that's a decision that's made by the decision makers at the moment. So I guess in that sense, it's also working, right? Because it's achieving the goal you sought to achieve, even if the goal is not good for the people of that country or humanity or probably the United States in the long run.
This is a question maybe primarily for Paul, but other people, a view from the outside, would be interested. And Lester, I was struck by what you said, that, you know, a country's history and kind of its personality might you know, tend it more towards corruption or kleptocracy. And I was thinking about that in relationship to the United States. And so much of America and America's identity is we're built around the self-conception. We're free to do what we want, make money how we want, work for who we want, and have a guarantee of privacy. You know, the last one being, you know, constitutional guarantee. And so this is the foundation. You know, this is obviously the foundation of Citizens United, which kind of embedded corruption into our elections, seemingly permanently, the right to free speech. So does the transparency and regulation that you need to root out corruption in America go so counter to the American psyche that we're never going to be able to address it?
Thanks, Ryan. Absolutely not. I mean, in fact, I would argue the exact opposite. I would argue America is a country founded in anti-corruption principles. The whole notion of, when you look at the founding fathers and the writers on this, they were almost obsessed with fighting corruption. I mean, it was in all the writings, in all the debates about the Constitution. The whole thing was about, like, how do we create a republic of virtue? How do we create a republic that prevents corruption, you know? Even the revolution itself, you know, against kleptocracy. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, walking away from a kleptocratic king, you know, and a kleptocratic system. It was seen as a corrupt system. I mean, so, you know, I actually think that the USA tends toward fighting corruption, and I think that you see this actually in the work that we do. You know, although I'm kind of laying out a lot of the gaps and a lot of the problems that we've seen historically. I mean, up until kind of the 80s and the end in 91 and kind of the paradigm that we've entered, we've been the world leader on fighting corruption. I mean, we had Bank Secrecy Act, the first ever anti-money laundering laws in the world. were from the United States. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which everybody here is pretty familiar with, the first ever Counter Foreign Bribery Act, the United States in the 70s. I mean, it was possible in Germany to write bribes off your taxes until the 90s. You know, I mean, so the United States has really been ahead of the game on a lot of things, and I think it's in our blood to be ahead of the game. I just think that we've had this viewpoint since the end of the Cold War that we were going to, you know, that democracy was inevitable, that there was this teleological notion of we won. And now everyone's we don't need to do anything else because we won. So we can integrate everything and we can be greedy and feel good being greedy because it's over, you know? And it's not. I mean, you know, it's not over. In fact, the opposite has happened. So we need to actually reestablish and remember our heritage and our kind of the virtues of our republic, you know, which I think are much more core and much more frequent in our history than these kind of like eras of you know, maybe excess, you know. Yeah.
But we can't talk about democracy without talking about economy also and money, right? I mean.
Okay. Hi, my name is Nurul. I represent Freedom for Eurasia organization, and my question goes into the sanctions. Actually, I'm very interested. There are ways of evading sanctions, and that's what Russia probably is doing right now through the customs union, through Eurasian Union, you know, through Kazakhstan, through all the other countries. So, what are the effective counter strategy to stop that?
I guess it's for Paul.
Yeah, no, I also advise on sanctions. So, look, I think that the most of the sanctions currently on Russia and most of our sanctions work pretty well. I mean, it depends on how you define work, right? I mean, if you want to, a lot of people look at them like, well, your sanctions haven't changed the regime. Well, who said regime change was the point? You know, I mean, you know, we want to reduce the capacity of Russia to kill Ukrainians, right? I mean, we want to reduce the capacity of these countries to do, you know, bad things in the world, and I think in that we've succeeded. I mean, particularly the freeze on central bank reserves was really extraordinary, and we know where those are, and that's just $300 billion just, you know, frozen, you know? The new oil cap should be pretty effective. The financial sanctions are great. I mean, where we kind of fall apart is the individualized oligarch sanctions, which, you know, we make a lot of hay out of. But they can, because we don't have the Enablers Act, because the corporate registry isn't set up yet, because we don't know where the money is, you know, I mean, it's really kind of funny. It's like, you know, we'd been advocating for a long time for these oligarchs to be sanctioned, to take a harder, you know, approach to this. And, you know, and then we finally were ready to do it after the full-scale invasion. But the fact is we don't know where we don't know where the stuff is. We don't know where the money is, you know, and even the big cases we make are almost entirely based on whistleblowers. You know, I mean, we really rely on whistleblowers to tell us where stuff is because we just don't have the reporting requirements. So I actually don't see Eurasian Union as being a big problem here. In fact, Eurasian Union's kind of fake anyway. I mean, you know, and just like CSTO and all this other stuff that Russia set up. I mean, I think Central Asian countries, so far as I can tell, are actually raising the eyebrow at Russia right now, like, uh-oh. You know, I mean, Russia's entered this, you know, imperial, you know, war-style, you know, approach. And I mean, you got to think the Kazakhs right now are like, well, you know, here's Medvedev, you know, drunk at like, you know, 2 in the morning, tweeting about how they're going to invade Kazakhstan. You know, I mean, so I'm just saying, like, I think that there's really no incentive on the part of those countries right now to help evade, even if they could. You know, and there's a lot of disincentive because if you do, we'll get you. And there have been some, for large-scale sanctions evasion, we do have good countermeasures for that. Some companies and Chinese companies and others have been sanctioned for, you know, engaging in sanctions evasion. And we've, you know, indicted Deripaska for sanctions evasion. There will be more indictments down the line. I mean, we have set up a very serious, probably the most serious in history network across, you know, the US, the EU, and the UK in the REPO, the Russian Elites, Proxies, and Oligarchs Task Force, you know, to go after these assets and to enforce sanctions.
So we also have a question from an online participant. Would you like to read it out?
Question from our virtual audience. How could the organized civil society gain access to the judicial system to protect the interests of the plundered country and the interests of its population?
Is it for the Maldives and Honduras?
It's open
I
for
think
it.
definitely you both should go. Would you like to repeat it once more?
Sure,
Please.
sorry if I rushed through it. How could the organized civil society gain access to the judicial system to protect the interests of the plundered country and the interests of its population?
So access to the judicial system.
Judicial system, correct, for civil society.
For civil society. Well, in the case of the Maldives, we've had, well, there's limited access for civil society to engage at any policy level or access to the judicial system, but we have had some policy successes where civil society is in a better position to engage, such as the RTI Act, for example, which was passed in 2014, where we've seen civil society and the media. It's been 8 years. Quite a lot of work has taken over the 8 years to engage civil society, to raise awareness on the RTA Act, and we are currently seeing civil society organizations and activists and journalists use the RTI as a tool to access information or the access public sector in order to hold people accountable.
Do you want to add, please? Yes.
Final words.
No.
Oh, okay. Well, in the case of my experience, personal experience, I mean, civil society is a very, diverse, term. I think that most of the times people and groups that access to justice are people who are interested in specific problems or services of the justice system. For instance, in our case, usually information about detentions is very important. Usually information about domestic violence cases. Groups that are not represented in society, underrepresented groups. I think those are the types of situations where the judicial systems should be more focalized. And I'm talking about more proactive transparency in those terms. I think that those are things that, in my experience, the judicial systems are very, very, I don't want to say, opaque with the information. They don't have a culture of providing information. And that has to do with also citizens understanding how the judicial system works. So I think it's, it's a two-way street in that case. And our job from civil society is not only asking for information, but also educating citizens about what information they need to have, right?
Thank you. And there is, please pass the mic to this lady here. Yeah.
We have time.
Hi, also Jordan, also from SIGAR. I was wondering if you could speak on sort of the fatigue that you face in fighting kleptocracy and how that may affect your work.
Is it directed to any particular speaker?
Anyone can answer.
Maybe all.
Well, as someone who moved from civil society to the anti-corruption agency and leading it, frankly, my experience over the past 10 years, there were moments where I'm very, very hopeful. Here I am, like, making all these policy recommendations, and I'm handed over the Anti-Corruption Commission to do that work. So I've been hopeful, but then there are times when you're so disillusioned because the day that I was forced to resign, for example, was not on International Anti-Corruption Day, but the decision to sack me was made on International Anti-Corruption Day in 2021. That's how theatrical it is. Because that was 2 hours before I was trying to organize an event to launch the national anti-corruption policy in the country. So moments like that makes you really disillusioned. And in fact, I was speaking to some of my colleagues here as well, saying that this conference has, in fact, has been really enlightening for me, like to, instead of look at obstacles and blocks in actually countering corruption, I think it's been very useful to try and find new solutions because it's been 1 year since I've resigned, but in a country like Maldives, it's very, very difficult to counter corruption, because the risks that you face, security risks, in my experience, I've had 3 attempts to take a no confidence vote against me. Before that, I am the first female anti-corruption president of the Anti-Corruption Commission in the Maldives as well. And being a woman leading a law enforcement agency in the country is also quite unheard of. So I faced specific threats and harassment only because I'm a woman as well. And in fact, there were different narratives that are used against you. So during the 2.5 years that I was there, the first narrative that was used against me and the entire commission was that we were stopping development projects because we were probing into large procurement cases, for example. The second narrative that was used was that we were only looking at cases from the current regime or current administration or ongoing cases. And the third narrative was because the commission was for the first time dominated by 3 women, the narrative was that we were not competent enough. So in moments like that, you get really disillusioned. But I always see this fight against corruption is for the long haul. You're going to face these sort of challenges, but it requires a lot of engagement, different people to, like in moments when you don't think this is going to work, like the continuous engagement really helps for me to overcome fatigue, to be honest.
Rukshan, you have a call.
Okay, this is more like the observation comment, and maybe would be good to get some of the responses. So my name is Rukshana. I currently work for International Land Coalition on large-scale land investments, but I used to work for Transparency International for 13 years. So particularly from the civil society part would be tremendously helpful from the Republican Institute or like from you guys, just to identify, when you talk about kleptocracy, so what are the patterns of like how this is happening, right? In terms of money trail, what are the commonalities? So people who fight these kind of stuff at national level, that would be really useful. And on the other hand, in civil society, in terms of like fighting against that, so I was in another session on sanctions and Magnitsky Act and how that was extremely helpful in terms of imposing sanctions. So it would be really good to hear like how some of the global north countries actually use these kind of tools to combat that, handle that, and impose sanctions, right? Of course, in the US, the Act, and there's Canada, and the UK has one, and we heard that Australia has just passed a law in December. And finally, I know some of my ex-colleagues from Transparency International who are still working on identifying grand corruption as a crimes against humanity under the ICC. And this is a huge ask, right? But for that, we need to really establish the case that when money's been plundered and laundered out of the country, what are its effects like on masses of people, on their health, their education, and even some of the environmental crimes, like through extractive industries, money has been taken out and given away. And that actually establishes the fact that this is a crimes against humanity at a larger scale. So it would be really good to hear about this from the panelists, and also would be really good to hear about some of the resources available in terms of fighting this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That's a great question. So maybe all 3 can answer and take a couple of minutes each to.
Yeah, I guess I'll take the sanctions part.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're sanctioning corrupt actors. It's the first time we've done. It's Global Magnitsky Act. First time we've done it since 2016. 2017 was the first tranche, so the laws exist since 2016. It's pretty new. The whole way that we're working through this is still like kind of being developed. There was that question earlier about like sort of access to justice. We rely heavily on civil society and civil society investigations and, independent information and open source information to develop these designations, right? So there's a lot of opportunities to provide this information in order to see, certain key individuals sanctioned under this, tool. Of course, all sorts of considerations come into play under this. Effectively with Global Magnitsky, the way it's written, you could sanction pretty much anybody. So you want to establish the type of individual you're going to sanction, the parameters, the evidence, and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's a very powerful tool. I think it can be used in a variety of ways. But I think it's total. It's kind of like its full purpose in effect is yet to be seen. I think we're still developing the tool. It's only been around for, it's only been used for 5 years, really.
Regarding sanctions also, we have like some, you could say, repercussions or collateral consequences from types of sanctions like Magnitsky, but more specifically, there's also an instrument the US government uses, it's called the Engels list. And what we've seen through the Engels list is like naming and shaming, right? And part of the purpose of the Engels list is to enlist the people who have been, committing corrupt acts, and part of the sanctions is that their visa, their tourist visa, is suspended. What we're seeing is that these people are going to other jurisdictions, other countries. It's not the U.S. Okay, let's go to Spain. It's not Spain. Well, let's go to France or England. So I think that it's a good first step to have sanctions, but I think there needs to be more of a global commitment of sanctions, especially from the developed world, because it's like the money. They just look for another jurisdiction, and the other consequence we're seeing from the Engels list is these kleptocrats. They're going against civil society actors at the national level because they think that we inform the Justice Department or the State Department that who are the kleptocrats and what are their dealings. So what we're getting is backlash from those types of actions. So I think this is something that we talked with Paul in Mexico a few months ago. And I think the US also has to understand that there are collateral damage or collateral acts in those sanction systems. Regarding trends and kleptocracy, I think something that for me is quite wide-opening is institutional fragility mixed with populism. When you get a populist president with a very populist agenda, of course, institutions don't really have a purpose, and they're easily captured. And that's what we saw in 2014 with Juan Orlando Hernandez, and probably that's what we're seeing right now, because institutions haven't been strengthened. And for my idea is, or my understanding of institutions is people, bureaucrats, have to have a career. They have to be professional public sector system. But when we have governments that every 4 or 5 years are cleaned out, we're not creating institutions. And those are one of the biggest impacts that the international community has. They're investing lots of money in strengthening institutions. They're doing workshops with different types of public sector institutions. But in 4 years, we have to teach them again about public administration. We have to teach them about OGP. We have to teach them about transparency, and those are the issues also. And that for me is one of the biggest trends that enables also kleptocratic systems from the structural level. Sorry there, it's quite a hard word.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions? Not really? Okay. So just to conclude, I think we give each of the speakers a couple of minutes because everything cannot end on that negative note. So there has to be some inspiration as we close. So what are your final thoughts? So I'll start again with, I'll skip you, Lester. I'll start with Paul then. Yeah.
Okay, final inspiring thought. Yeah? Okay. I mean, we're going to win this is kind of the final inspiring thought. I mean, we've recognized the problem. We know what the solutions are. And it's all about, at this point, building coalitions. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation because it's like, I mean, we already have the blueprint to fix it. We just have to implement it. So we're up against a lot of entrenched interests that are very powerful and that are, going to want to keep their payday. But at the end of the day, they're not going to win. I mean, they're not going to be able to, overcome the coalitions we're able to build. So it's all about keeping focus and working together and getting, driving ourselves together and getting this stuff implemented. But then what it is, I mean, the snowball effect once this stuff starts going is pretty extraordinary, because it's not just the laws that get in place, it's the norms that get in place. And once you once you have it such that at the New York's powerful law firms, it's just totally unacceptable to be helping with money laundering or be working for kleptocrats and so on and so forth. You basically won. So you need to get those norms in place, and that's going to take some time. But we know what the solutions are, and we have the ability to do it. We have the will to do it. So it's just going to take time and effort, and nose to the grindstone.
Mariyam?
I think it's important to remember that in fledgling democracies where we have authoritarian rule and we have periods of democratic hope and all, I think it's important to remember that the kleptocrats, they do reinvent themselves again. I mean, you can sentence people, like in the case of the Maldives, for example, you can sentence people, but they can still contest in the next election because they will entirely reinvent themselves. Even if you vote them out, they will come back again. So in my opinion, what I am looking for is really a generational change, and we're in this for the long haul. In countries like Maldives, we also we also have to work to change democratic culture in the country if we are to fight corruption in the long run. And also, I also think it's important to know that when a window of opportunity is there, what strategic interventions do you need to undertake? And also, as well, in countries like Maldives, you need to be prepared when that kleptocrat or authoritarian leader comes back into power. What do you do? What are your safety measures? Mm-hmm. How are you going to continue undertaking these different interventions that you are currently undertaking at times where you can actually work with institutions? And I also think it's very important to ensure that that we continue to support civil society organizations as well as media who will continue to be your voice when authoritarian leaders come back into power. Thank you.
I think, well, in the short term, I think that we must invest in youth, and two things, youth and digital activism. I think that's the future, or that's the present. And it's something that I'm really astonished when our president from Transparency International was in the plenary, is that when she asked how many people here are under 30 years old, it was a very, very small group of people that stood up. I think these spaces, we have to bring youth to the forefront also. Just to give you an example, and I saw your work in El Salvador. I mean, you're doing a great job, and it means there's a lot of risk involved. And as we get older, we don't want to take those risks. Most of the times when we were younger, we took a lot of risk. And I mean, we have to understand how we behave as people, as activists also. And I think it's very important to give them the voice and give them the opportunity to do digital activism. And I think that's something that we have to invest on.
So thank you. Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Mariyam. And thank you, Lester. Thank you for being here. Such a wonderful audience. 5 o'clock and you're still here. Thank you for being here.
Let's go to the bar.